No one tells you the truth about Russia's shadow fleet, but the US Navy just exposed it in the most brutal way possible. 3:14 a.m., the Bay of Biscay, aboard the French aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle, a young radar tech is looking at a Phantom. A small, low RCS drone has just been catapulted from the deck of the Zhigulevsk, a Russian Project 864 intelligence ship masquerading as a research vessel just 12 miles away. The drone is closing at 145 miles per hour, and in the CIC, the TAO has exactly 18 seconds to decide if this is a surveillance flyby or a kamikaze strike. If that drone carries even 5 pounds of high explosives and hits a parked Rafale M on the flight deck, the French flagship is out of the fight. But the French aren't alone. 50 miles to the north, the USS Arleigh Burke has already captured the track via a satellite data bridge. The Russian commander on the Zhigulevsk thinks he's testing NATO's reaction time. He's about to find out that the reaction isn't just fast, it's merciless. To understand why the US Navy reacted with such overwhelming force, you have to look at what happened 3 weeks prior in the North Sea. The British frigate HMS Richmond was shadowing a group of Russian Shadow Fleet tankers, uninsured rust bucket vessels Russia uses to bypass oil sanctions. These ships, highlighted by the IISS as a major security threat, aren't just carrying oil, they are carrying sensors. Without warning, the bridge of the HMS Richmond was hit by a high-energy optical dazzler, a military-grade laser fired from a Russian tug following the tankers. It wasn't meant to sink the ship, it was meant to blind the crew and fry the ship's electro-optical sensors. For 45 seconds, the British frigate was effectively sightless in a high-traffic shipping lane. Moscow used this incident to map the NATO hesitation gap. They wanted to see if the British would fire back or retreat. When the British followed standard maritime protocol and issued a diplomatic protest, the Kremlin viewed it as a green light. They believed NATO was too tied up in legal rules of engagement to respond to gray zone aggression. This was their first and most fatal mistake. While Russia was analyzing the British retreat, the US Sixth Fleet was already rewriting the engagement software for every destroyer in the Atlantic. They were building a kill web that would turn Russia's hybrid warfare into a high-speed trap. Fast forward to the Bay of Biscay, the Zhigulevsk incident documented by Defense UA was the moment Russia stopped playing with lasers and started playing with fire. By launching a drone directly at a French carrier during the PEAN exercise, Russia moved from harassment to kinetic intent. In the eyes of the US Navy, this was the unforgivable move. You do not target a carrier, the center of NATO's power projection, and expect a polite radio call. The Zhigulevsk isn't a warship in the traditional sense. It's an intelligence gatherer packed with antennas and SIGINT suites designed to soak up Western electronic signatures. By launching a drone, they were trying to force the Charles de Gaulle to turn on its high-power fire control radars. The Russian logic was simple. Launch a $10,000 drone, force the French to use their $100 million radar systems, record the frequencies, and then sell that data to electronic warfare units back in Kaliningrad. It was a low-cost, high-reward gamble. But the US Navy didn't want the French to turn on their radars at all. Inside the USS Arleigh Burke, the Aegis combat system was operating in passive multi-static mode. This is the tech Russia didn't anticipate. Instead of the US ship sending out a ping that the Russians could detect, the Arleigh Burke was simply listening to the radio waves already in the air, commercial satellite signals, television broadcasts, even the Russian ship's own legacy navigation radar. By measuring how those waves bounced off the inbound drone, the US destroyer had a perfect firing solution without ever emitting a single watt of energy. At 3:16 a.m., the TAO on the USS Arleigh Burke gave the order. Batteries released, bird away. A Mark 41 vertical launch system cell exploded open. ARIM-162 ESSM shrieked into the night sky. This wasn't a standard intercept. The RIM-162 ESSM was being guided by a remote track provided by the French carrier's passive infrared sensors. This is the kill web in action. The US Navy fired the bullet, but the French provided the eyes. The Russian drone didn't even have time to maneuver. the RIM-162ESSM, capable of pulling 50 Gs and moving at over 1,900 miles per hour, slammed into the drone 5 miles from the carrier. The resulting explosion was small, but the message was deafening. But the retaliation was just beginning. The U.S. Navy doesn't just knock down the drone, they erase the threat's ability to function. Two EA-18G Growlers, which had been loitering 30,000 feet above the Bay of Biscay, dived toward the Zhigalevsk. They didn't fire missiles, they fired digital napalm. The pilots activated the AL-Q-218 tactical jamming pods, focusing a narrow, high-intensity beam of electronic noise directly at the Russian ship's antenna farm. On the Zhigalevsk, the scene was pure chaos. Every screen in their SIGINT suite turned into a blinding white glare. Their satellite uplink to Moscow was severed. Their internal communications were flooded with high-pitched feedback. In the span of 3 minutes, Russia's most advanced spy ship in the Atlantic had been turned into a $200 million piece of floating scrap metal. While the Russian crew was struggling to figure out why their radios were screaming, the ocean surface 400 yards off their starboard bow began to churn. A black tower of steel broke the water. Then a hull, then 560 feet of nuclear-powered menace. The USS Florida, an Ohio-class guided missile submarine, performed a tactical surface. For a submarine to surface that close to an enemy ship means it has been sitting under them for hours or even days, and the enemy had no idea. The USS Florida carries 154 BGM-109 Tomahawk cruise missiles. By surfacing, the U.S. Navy was telling the Russian commander, "We didn't just see your drone. We have been sitting in your shadow, ready to erase you from the map before you even launched it." To emphasize the point, the USS R. Lee Burke accelerated to 34 miles per hour and began a high-speed circle of dominance around the Russian ship. They didn't just stay close, they trained their Mark 45 5-inch deck gun directly on the Zhigalevsk's bridge. They also locked onto the ship with their fire control system for the RIM-66 Standard MR. RIM-66 Standard MR is usually an air defense missile, but it has a secondary surface strike mode that can shred a ship's superstructure in seconds. The Russian commander could see the American sailors on the deck. He could see the optics of the fire control system tracking his every move. He was checkmated in 3 dimensions, jammed from the air, tracked from the surface, and haunted from the depths. The IISS report on the Russian Shadow Fleet warns that these ships are a hybrid threat used to mask military operations under the guise of commercial trade. But in the Bay of Biscay, the U.S. Navy proved that masking only works if the opponent isn't looking. NATO has shifted to a full-spectrum transparency model by using the RIM-174 Standard Array Mass, a multi-domain interceptor. The U.S. Navy has created a bubble that Russia cannot penetrate, the RIM-174 Standard Aramis, perhaps the most versatile missile in the world, capable of hitting ballistic missiles and space cruise missiles at sea level and even surface ships over the horizon. During this engagement, the USS R. Lee Burke had several RIM-174 Standard ERAM missiles on hot standby. If the Russians had attempted to launch a second drone or fire a defensive weapon, the RIM-174 Standard ERAM would have hit the Zhigalevsk before the Russian projectile had even cleared the deck. The tactical coordination between the US, UK, and France was the real retaliation. Russia's entire strategy relies on NATO being fractured. They thought the laser incident with the British wouldn't be shared with the French. They thought the US wouldn't intervene in a French-Russian dispute. Instead, they were met with a unified front that operated like a single machine. The British provided the intelligence on Russian laser tactics. The French provided the sensor data for the drone. The Americans provided the RIM-162 ESSM that ended the threat. The Shadow Fleet is now no longer a shadow. Every one of those 600-plus tankers and research ships is now being tracked by NATO AI systems. Their engine signatures, their crew's radio habits, and their hull vibrations are all in the U.S. Navy's database. Russia tried to use civilian ships to gain an advantage. They ended up giving NATO a map of their entire covert logistics network. The technical reason Russia failed is decision superiority. In the Russian Navy, the commander of the Zhigalevsk likely had to wait for a signal from the Kremlin or the Northern Fleet HQ before he could even launch that drone. In the U.S. Navy, the TAO on the Arleigh Burke has the delegated authority to defend the force without calling Washington. The speed of the American kill chain from detection to the launch of the RIM-162 ESSM is measured in seconds. The Russian kill chain is measured in minutes. By the time Moscow realized their drone had been shot down, the USS Florida was already surfacing. By the time they tried to order a retreat, the Growlers had already jammed the ship's comms. The U.S. Navy was 3 steps ahead of the Russian decision-making process for the entire 12-minute engagement. This is the result of decades of investment in network-centric warfare. Russia has big missiles, they have fast ships, but they don't have the web. They don't have the ability to link a British sensor to a French carrier and a U.S. missile. Without that link, they are just a collection of isolated targets waiting to be picked off. Despite the high-tech missiles like the RIM-174 Standard era, man, the billion-dollar submarines, the night belonged to the sailors. Think about the crew of the HMS Richmond. They took the laser hit and didn't panic. They stayed on station, recorded the data, and passed it up the chain. That data is what allowed the U.S. Navy to recognize the electronic fingerprint of the Russian jamming attempts later on. Think about the TAO on the Arleigh Burke. He watched a Russian ship commit an act of war and he didn't flinch. He followed the escalation ladder perfectly, neutralized the threat, blind the aggressor, then showed the teeth. When the sun rose over the Bay of Biscay at 6 a.m., the Charles de Gaulle was still launching aircraft. The carrier's flight deck was a hive of activity, as if nothing had happened. The American destroyer was back in its planned guard station, and the USS Florida had slipped back beneath the waves, once again invisible. There were no headlines in the Russian media about their bold move. There was only silence. Because how do you explain to your public that your advanced spy ship was bullied by a single U.S. destroyer and a submarine that spawned out of nowhere? The unforgivable move in the Bay of Biscay was a strategic blunder of historic proportions. Russia tried to use the shadow fleet and hybrid tactics to prove that NATO was weak. Instead, they proved that NATO is more integrated than ever. The U.S. Navy's merciless retaliation wasn't an act of anger, it was an act of professional erasure. They didn't just stop the attack, they erased the Russian ship's ability to even exist as a military entity in that battle space. The lesson is clear. The gray zone is no longer a safe place for Russia to hide. Whether it's lasers in the North Sea or drones in the Bay of Biscay, the U.S. Navy's kill web is always watching. And if you cross that line, you won't just be met with a protest. You'll be met with a RIM-162 ESSMA BGM-109 Tomahawk and a nuclear submarine surfacing in your wake. For the world's most powerful navy, it wasn't a conflict. It wasn't a crisis. It was just another day of ensuring that the rules of the ocean are written by those who have the power to enforce them. Russia tried to move a piece on the board. The U.S. Navy just reminded them who owns the board. For the sailors on the Arleigh Burke, the mission was over. It was time for a shift change and breakfast. The Russian unforgivable move was documented, analyzed, and neutralized. And as the Zhigulevsk limped back toward the Baltic, its crew likely realized one terrifying truth. In a real war, that 12-minute countdown wouldn't have ended with a surfaced submarine. It would have ended with a silent ocean. What part of this retaliation was the most shocking to you? Was it the U.S. Navy using French data to fire a missile, or the psychological impact of a nuclear submarine surfacing right next to the Russian spy ship? Russia's shadow fleet logic has been shattered, but the gray zone war is far from over. Let us know your tactical analysis in the comments. We read everyone to see who truly understands the future of naval dominance. If you want to stay updated on the technical reality of the kill web and see more deep dives into the U.S. Navy's merciless efficiency, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We bring you the tech, the tactics, and the truth that the mainstream media misses. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon. The U.S. Navy certainly is.